Hello class, Dr. Del Garza here for Communication 300, and today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, power and knowledge, and the relationship between those two. So let's get started. First of all, I think there are some important things I want you to reflect on, right? Why does it hurt to step out of our ideology, right? Why is it so uncomfortable for us to witness or take seriously perspectives that differ from or challenge our own ideological perspectives? You see this a lot right now in American politics, and it's not accidental. Ideology is a trap. It is a cage for your reason, and it gives you the option of being lazy about the decisions you make. But it also allows you a kind of pleasure in the grounded and in knowing what you believe and being able to identify, right, with a particular group. Why does freedom hurt? And I know that seems like an interesting thing, but like a strange question to ask. But Americans have very deep love of authoritarianism. In the United States, we talk about being a free society, but if you look at how we actually structure our lives, it's very, very authoritarian. It's based on strong leadership, right? It's based on rule of law. In fact, we are such an unfree society, and there have been many studies done on this, by the way, that on average, every American commits at least 3 felonies over the course of a day. And by the time you reach your 30s, 90 some odd percent of American citizens have done a crime for which they would do time had they been caught, right? So we find ourselves in this weird double bind where we are, in theory, a freedom-loving people, but also very, very much afraid of freedom. And typically the reason that people are afraid of freedom is because they don't feel safe unless they can control their environment. And a free world is one in which you don't have that kind of control. You don't have the illusion of that kind of control. And that's why we shy away from doing things that would actually make us free. In fact, most of the time we actually do things, cage things, have ideas that chain us a little bit, limit our capacity. How is ideology an empty container, right? What does ideology do? Also, I want you to understand the cynical function of ideology. They know what they're doing, right? But they're still doing it, even though they know it's not necessarily good for them or good for you. So this brings us to one of my favorite scholars, Michel Foucault. All right, so Michel Foucault was born in the 1920s, lived until 1984. He comes from a wealthy family. His doctor and his grandfather were famous surgeons. He had a degree in psychology, and Foucault's history is kind of interesting. So he was this brilliant mind who was queer, and the pressure of his family's respectability, having to be in the closet, being as smart and sensitive as he was, led Foucault at young, we're talking in his 20s, in his school days, to attempt suicide. At which point, his family took him against his will and they put him in a mental hospital. And that trauma informed a lot of Foucault's relationship and his theories on power and how power functions. And, in this country, and certainly in Foucault's time, we treated people for being gay through typically what was called aversion therapy. And aversion therapy is a nice way to say torture. The thought was that if you could inflict enough pain on someone every time they had a gay thought, that then they would get conditioned to feel pain when they experienced homosexual love or attraction. And that pain, that conditioned trauma, would make them straight. And it's a barbaric practice. And it's a practice that we still, in the United States today, certain religious organizations continue. After school, Foucault becomes this advocate and activist, and he also eventually heads the philosophy department at the Experimental University of, I'm going to screw this up, my French is not great, Vincennes in 1968. Foucault is a rock star of a professor. He is, at this point, sexually out as queer, very deep into the BDSM club LSD scene, and dies of an AIDS-related illness relatively young. But his legacy on our field and our understanding about the relationship between knowledge and power is one of the most enduring and important perspectives we have in the field. So let's talk about his work. The first form we have to understand is that of discursive formation. Discursive formations control what kinds of knowledge we count as true. And we're talking about culturally society-wide. So what kinds of knowledge are intelligible, right? And what that means is what types of knowledge aren't just crazy talk. I'll give you an example. Prior to 2020, if you believed in UFOs, that was unintelligible to most of Americans. You would sound like a crazy person if you went on public TV or in front of a class and you're like, hey, there's UFOs and the CIA is hiding that from us. And then somewhere between the pandemic and murder hornets, the CIA released footage and recognized that UFOs exist. And now, right, having conversations about UFOs and murder hornets and the apocalypse are intelligible, right? It's not just crazy talk. There's something to it. What types of knowledge are authoritative? So, authority and power, if we go back to our materialist talk, right, are how ideas get traction. They're how ideas get taken up, regardless if that idea is necessarily good or bad, right? Foucault understands this and talks about this in the terms of authoritative knowledge. So because I'm a scholar of communication, and I study race, and I study immigration, when I write and publish my research, that is authoritative knowledge. That is knowledge from an expert, someone who is credentialed, someone who is vetted, and someone who is in a place to produce truth. And truly, this is why I do research, and this is why I do the work I do. Is because I recognized coming up that the authoritative accounts of immigration, of race, and of a people's rhetoric excluded or ignored social realities that I saw in my political work and in my everyday life. And so I decided to co-opt, right, those mechanisms of power to create authoritative knowledge that shows the truths I see. These discursive formations allow us to understand which statements we can count as serious, that we have to listen to, who is authorized to speak on those, what can and cannot be discussed, right? And this shifts and flows depending on time and context. So for example, previously, so anti-vaxxers, um, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, those people were considered fringe, insane, not to be listened to, not to be taken seriously. Over the last several years, the anti-vax movement has become more intelligible. Um, More and more people are listening and having those conversations. And now, in the era of COVID, right, we even have mainstream politicians questioning whether or not we should take the vaccine that's produced in this time period. And, the polls say that something like 30 to 60% of Americans won't take the vaccine, even if it becomes available, right? Other forms of knowledge that are kind of fringe, right, and then move, right, the Obama birth certificate, whether or not Epstein killed himself, Trump's golden shower controversy, right? These are all forms of knowledge that our public took seriously for a minute, debated, and then ignored, or didn't take seriously, debated, and then have taken up. And that just explains how different types of truth can be authorized across different contexts. These discursive formations provide a mechanism for representing the nature and society of people. They form our mental maps of social relationships, of right and wrong, of appropriateness. And these provide frameworks, words and images for thinking about the world and understanding our place in it. Eventually, right, scientific knowledge gets disciplined, cut into disciplines: communication, psychology, philosophy, math, history. And these disciplines begin to develop their own systems of knowledge and their own discursive formations. Who can talk, what is believed to be true, what is considered insane, who you can criticize where. But again, these change over time. These historical eras differ not just in what people think, but what is even thinkable, right? What is possible to conceptualize as an idea. And Foucault's most famous works are works where he explores how these discourses, in particular science, health, medicine, legal discourse, form, right? Laws are just words. Jurisprudence, trials, decisions, all of that is symbolic. All of that is a product and effect of discourse. And so as we begin to build a world out of symbols, right, the discourses we use construct and frame our experience of the world. And as a result, what we can think, what we can say, what we can imagine are constrained by the limits of these discourses. Discipline. Discipline is a mechanism of power that regulates the thoughts and behaviors of social actors through subtle means. And it comes in all kinds of ways, and it happens to us very early, right? Very early on, for example, we tend to have our sexuality and gender disciplined. I see it with my best friend's kids, By 4 years old, right, my best friend's daughter understood the difference between boys and girls, pink, why pink was better than blue, that girls should get married to boys, and that she herself was a girl, right? Now, as she grows up and becomes more and more exposed to the discourses that define and describe gender in the United States, her expression of gender, the way she performs herself and her identity, is going to become more and more in line with girl, right? With our culture says what a girl should be, what she looks like, how she should behave, the values, the discipline. That is discipline. Now it's possible for people to resist it, to make other choices, but by the time we are capable of understanding ourselves and power well enough to make those decisions, most of the fundamental aspects of our identity have already been disciplined into us. They've become a habit. They've just become our way of viewing the world. Speaking of the ways of viewing the world, one of Foucault's next important theories is the notion of the panopticon. The panopticon automizes and disindividualizes power so that no individual welds or commands it. Now let me break this down. The panopticon was an experimental prison designed by Jeremy Bentham. The way this prison works is you have a single guard tower in the center. That guard tower has a 360-degree view around it, and the prison itself is built in a circle around that guard tower. The cells have one-way windows, right, that allows the guard to see in, but does not allow the inmates to see out. As a result, at any given time, the guard can surveil, watch, and then discipline the inmate. The inmate never knows if they're being watched. And because there's only one guard in a 360-degree view, the guard can't watch everywhere. The reason Bentham decided that this was the prison, right, this experimental prison, was because the recognition by the prisoners that they were being surveilled, that they couldn't control when they were going to be surveilled, and the recognition that punishment would follow if they were surveilled doing something wrong, meant that the prisoners lived in a state of constant anxiety, always wondering if they were being watched. And as a result, those prisoners put that guard into their head, and they begin to act as if they are always being watched. The prisoners themselves become their own jailer, right? That voice in their head. And eventually, Bentham says you can just remove the guard, and the prisoners will continue to discipline themselves, continue to watch themselves, monitor themselves, because now they are their own jailer. Foucault takes this prison and he makes it a metaphor for our social relations, and in particular our relationships to power. The best example I have of this is, it's like 3 a.m., you're coming home, no one on the road for miles, and you pull up to a stoplight, and the light is red, and you sit there, and you wait, and there's no one there, and you wait, and there's no one there, and you wait, and then the light turns green and you go. The reason you are waiting, right, is because the cop in your head has you so well disciplined that you wouldn't consider breaking that law, even when there was no one to enforce it. That's how you control a population. That is discipline writ large in a society. And Foucault wants us to understand that this is how you really exercise power, right? This is what it means to control a population, to achieve hegemony, that kind of leadership. In order for disciplinary power to be exercised, it had to be given the instrument of permanent, exhaustive, omnipresent surveillance, right? Constantly being watched, like we are right now. Capable of making everything visible as long as it itself could remain invisible. And it's interesting because we carry surveillance equipment with us all over. The KGB, right? The Stasi, right? The fascist police officers, cops, intelligence agencies that like were the enemies in all of our films, like especially growing up during the Cold War. They would kill for the amount of access that Americans give corporations by clicking yes on that user and license agreement. It had to be a faceless gaze, thousands of eyes posted everywhere. And once we reach that state, we don't need police to discipline us. We don't need the Stasi to control us or keep us afraid. We do that to ourselves. And that's the power, right? That understanding discipline and how humans respond to surveillance and power, it works. It's a very effective way to control the masses. And you're only ever capable of freeing yourself from it if you make that invisible, omnipresent, exhaustive gaze visible, if you put a face to it, if you understand how it works, then you can act against it. So what is power? Power is not something that is acquired, seized, or shared, something that one holds on to or allows to slip away. Power is employed through a net-like organization. It is a field of relationships that seduce a group of people into agreeing and participating with the rightness of the action. Power is like the force. It flows between individuals. It exists in every social relationship, in every dynamic. It isn't static. You can move from one space and be the most powerful person in that space to another space and be the least powerful person in that space. And there are all kinds of ways of having, manipulating, moving power. Beauty is a kind of power. Intelligence is a kind of power. Assertiveness and aggression are a type of power. Money, class, education, right? All of these are elements that you can use in these fields of relationship, right? To seduce people into agreeing with and participating in your action. Power is everywhere, not because it embraces everything, right? But because it comes from everywhere. All humans within any sort of social organization, whether that be a class, a work group, a job, or a country, right, participate in giving and receiving in that network of power. Power is dispersed through the swarming of disciplinary mechanisms, meaning your church, your laws, your media, your schools, your family, your friends. All of that disciplines and teaches us how to act and behave. Power is not static. Power can be exercised through coordinated social action. And knowledge of its effective use requires understanding how the present actions of a dominant agent, right, so those in power, count on the future actions of the aligned agents being similar in their past actions, right? And so what this means is you have to have a good understanding of history and the human condition and how people respond to these different forces in order to effectively manipulate those forces. The relationship between power and knowledge is strategic, right? There are these embedded structures of meaning, of rightness, of epistemology that forms what we know, right? And that creates the actions and the conditions that we think are natural and rational. But remember, in the world of symbols, in the human world, right, all of this is constructed. None of it exists naturally or a priori, right? We give our consent to these things. We give our meaning to these things. And this dynamic between knowledge and power shapes what we know to be true, who can say what to whom, what can be talked about, who can be laughed at or criticized. And real talk, if you want to know who owns you, right, look to the person in your social world who you cannot openly laugh at or criticize. And you will understand right there that that person has real power over you. What counts as fact? What counts as insane? And what counts as deviant, or criminal. Power and social relations is just war by other means. Language is a system of meaning governed by rules. While war seems senseless, but is also systematic and governed by norms. We can't meaningfully understand the totality of power relations. They're too big. There's too much there. But we can make these specific, tactical, precise interventions in these relationships of power to manipulate them. Resistance isn't external to power, right? Resisting power doesn't mean you have power, and it doesn't make power go away. Resistance is part of the play and flow and exchange of power. But also, no matter how subordinate you are, because power is this force-like thing, right, that flows between people, you're never actually powerless. And like power, resistance happens everywhere. And power and knowledge, right, play in this dynamic that is co-constituted, right? It's built by both the people who enjoy it and perform it, and those people who resist it and challenge it. And within those structures of meaning, right, that's where we as individuals have opportunities to make choices about to what extent we participate or resist or change or not participate in power. So that is Knowledge and Power and Michel Foucault. Thank you very much for listening. Have a good week.